Insurance fraud in the UK costs more than £1.2 billion a year. That's more than £3 million a day. Deliberate crashes, bogus personal injuries, even phantom pets. The fraudsters are risking more and more to make a quick killing, and every year it's adding more than £50 to your insurance bill. But insurers are fighting back, exposing a fraudulent claim every 5 minutes, armed with the latest fraud-busting technology, including covert surveillance systems, sophisticated data analysis techniques, and specially trained fraud investigators. They're catching these chancers red-handed. Instead of getting away with it, more and more of these fraudsters are being caught out and claimed and shamed. Today on Claimed and Shamed, a DJ's injury claim hits the deck when online posts show he'd been spinning a tall tale.
We discovered that he had actually travelled to Dubai, even though he said that he had travel anxiety and wasn't able to travel. And we also discovered that he was working as well while he was there.
Phone woes. A driver who demanded a cash payout after a minor collision is caught out by her own text messages.
The key evidence in this case was the messaging between the parties, because it was quite clear from that messaging that there was no injury at the scene and there was no injury claim being progressed until later on.
And a holidaymaker who claimed she'd lost valuables worth thousands of pounds on her way home is caught out online.
There was several social media posts on her social media accounts where it showed that she was wearing the jewellery and that she reported missing, and these were after the date that she reported they went missing.
Insurance fraud is rampant, with the industry detecting close to 100,000 dishonest claims a year, valued at more than £1 billion. Yet, in this digital age, it's astounding that scammers still think they can get away with it. These days, tech-savvy investigators only need to boot up their laptops to catch the tricksters out, with tools at their disposal which weren't around just a matter of years ago. Today, we'll see them exposing dodgy claims by analysing text messages, CCTV footage, and, of course, social media, as in our first case. It all started with a collision between a Mercedes and a van at a set of traffic lights in Hammersmith in London. A claim which was ultimately derailed by a DJ set thousands of miles away in Dubai. With almost £15,000 at stake, when it landed on fraud investigator Ben McBean's desk, he got down to business straight away.
On the day of the accident, the claimant was driving a car and our insured was driving a small works van. As he approached some traffic lights, the lights turned to amber and our insured driver assumed that he was going to drive through. He didn't, he decided to stop and our insured driver hit him in the rear of the vehicle.
The initial claim was dealt with quickly.
Within 6 days of the claim being made, we admitted liability because it was quite a straightforward case of fault on our insured's behalf.
The insurance company was keen to keep costs to a minimum, particularly for the claimant's use of a pricey hire vehicle while his damaged car was being repaired.
The main impetus for any insurer in dealing with a claim so quickly is to try and make sure that any claim for credit hire doesn't escalate. So in our case, it was a case of it being quite a straightforward incident, so we needed to admit liability and deal with the vehicle damage.
Then, 3 weeks later, another claim came in from the DJ whose car had been crashed into, this time for serious injuries he'd suffered as a result of the collision.
He claimed that he'd suffered injuries to his neck, his lower back, his shoulders, and also suffered anxiety as a result of the accident.
Serious stuff. It seemed he'd also underestimated the extent of the damage to his car and now wanted it replaced.
He sustained significant vehicle damage as well, according to his account, which potentially would write off his vehicle.
The costs were starting to rack up.
We estimated that the damages would roughly be about £3,500 for the injuries, £4,000 for the loss of earnings, £4,000 again for the vehicle damage and about £1,700 for the car hire. The total of the claim was about £13,500.
But Ben had niggling doubts about the extent of the claimant's reported injuries.
I think the first suspicions we had about this claim were because the version of events that we received from our policyholder suggested that the collision was a lot less significant. Our insured said that the collision was about 5 miles per hour, so suggested that there potentially wouldn't be much damage to the vehicle, let alone any personal injury.
And the van driver said something else that troubled Ben.
He said that the car driver was quite reluctant to share his details. So then when we received the formal notification of claim describing injuries, it was a bit of a concern to us.
It wasn't clear why the claimant had been worried about exchanging his details. So, in an effort to help, Ben reached out to the DJ.
We instructed our in-house rehabilitation team to contact the claimant to see if we could support him to recuperate and reduce any impact on his ability to work, but that was rejected.
Again, this was mysterious, but it didn't prove any wrongdoing. 5 months later, Ben received a medical report from the claimant's GP. Rather than quelling his concerns, this only added to his increasing unease about the case.
He had actually been interviewed via Zoom, which we kind of had to accept due to COVID restrictions, but it does cause you some concern that they haven't been able to see them in person. Another aspect to it was that the GP expert hadn't actually received his records to validate anything he said. And some of the descriptions of the impact upon his life seemed a bit extreme, in that he said that he struggled to do housework, couldn't go to the gym, he needed support to do various different aspects of daily living.
The list of conditions the DJ suffered from went on and on.
And then the GP expert also commented upon travel anxiety, which he described as PTSD. It all seemed to be a bit much, so it was something we had to look further into.
Ben needed to know more about this Mercedes driving DJ before he could consider paying out. He started by going through his social media posts and was staggered by what he found. The DJ had been busy.
We discovered that he had actually travelled to Dubai, even though he said that he had travel anxiety and wasn't able to travel for work. And we also discovered that he was working as well while he was there, so it all contradicted the claim that he'd made for injuries and lost earnings.
And this work was no small backstreet gig.
We discovered that he was quite a high-profile DJ and that he had actually been working through that month and afterwards when he told us that he couldn't. There were many instances where he'd posted photographic evidence of him with different people in different nightclubs, and there was also video footage of that as well, so that was a major concern for us in this case.
It was becoming clear to Ben that this claimant hadn't been entirely honest about his injuries.
You'd expect that a DJ would really struggle to be stood up all evening and work some decks if they truly had a back injury, a neck injury and shoulder injuries as well, let alone being able to travel quite a long distance if you've got a fear of travel as well.
The claimant was questioned about his trip abroad, but he had an answer for that.
He admitted that he had actually travelled to Dubai, although he said it was a little bit later than the evidence we've seen, and that the evidence we'd seen was a previous year, and it was an old photograph.
That, though, didn't ring true, because Ben discovered the dates he'd given for the previous year didn't match with the nightclub's promotional material found online.
The advertising was all there on the days that he was supposed to be there. There was no indication that they'd been changed or cancelled or anything, so to all intents and purposes it did go ahead because we had the evidence that it was advertised and that he was there in different photographs.
Then the DJ came up with another explanation, claiming that he was simply posing for publicity photos and wasn't actually working. But that didn't wash with Ben either.
He'd still travelled to Dubai to work, whichever shape or form that was, and he was still doing things that he said he couldn't do, so it didn't really make a lot of difference.
The insurance company refused to cough up. Having reached a dead end, the claimant pushed to take his case to court.
Because the claimant didn't get what he wanted, he then decided to issue proceedings against QBE, and our response to that was to issue a fundamental dishonesty defence.
It was time for Ben to present the claimant with the evidence he'd gathered, and the DJ immediately began backtracking.
His response to the defence was to try and change his statement and provide different excuses as to why his recollection was different. He said things such as different photographs were from different years, and also his recollection was maybe slightly inaccurate because his mother had been unwell and he was focused upon that instead.
Whether or not he was telling the truth about his mother, the DJ was still on very shaky ground.
No matter how many different excuses he came up with, it still came back to the fact that he lied about what he was able to do and what he couldn't do.
By now, the claimant was getting desperate.
As a last-ditch attempt by him to try and recoup something by way of personal injury, he'd said that instead of going to court, he'd be willing to take £3,000, but if we didn't give him £3,000, he would actually be going to court as a threat to us.
Ben wasn't buying it, and instead gave the claimant one last chance. If he agreed to withdraw his claim and walk away, Ben wouldn't pursue him for any of the costs that had already been incurred. This was a savvy call, considering where the DJ was now spinning the decks.
Part of the reason for our offer to the claimant that he could leave the claim without any cost repercussions was that he'd actually moved to Ibiza, so any recovery would have been very challenging for us, so it made sense that we got out of it as quickly as possible.
Thankfully, the DJ saw sense and took the deal. Ben thinks he had a lucky escape, but his actions will have a long-term impact on his life.
Following the outcome of the claim, we added him to one of our databases, which is shared with other financial institutions and insurers. So that would mean that if he came to get a bank account, credit card, or other insurance products, then potentially he would flag up as someone of concern.
Later, how investigators uncovered the hidden link between a group of strangers claiming thousands of pounds after a car crash.
The fact that we had connections potentially between the occupants of the two vehicles is a red flag for the accident being potentially staged.
When insurance claims are made, all sorts of evidence is submitted by both sides, including almost anything that you can capture on your mobile phone, including photos, videos and messages. In our next case, analysis of a text exchange between two women resulted in one of them being caught out by investigators, probably leaving her wishing she'd never pressed send. Lawyer Sarah Hill of Clyde & Co is a counter-fraud expert who deals with fraudulent claims on behalf of the UK's biggest motor insurance companies. As well as coordinating complex investigations, she also oversees minor motor bumps, like in our next case.
This was a road traffic collision. The claimant was a female driver. She was at a set of traffic lights, and our driver, unfortunately, went into the rear of the claimant's vehicle. Following the impact, both drivers got out the vehicle. Both ladies inspected the damage to the vehicles, and it was agreed at the scene that there wasn't any damage. And in fact, the reason it was agreed there wasn't any damage was because the claimant's vehicle was in quite a poor state of repair. There was already existing damage to the claimant's vehicle.
Having reached an agreement and exchanged details, the drivers went on their way, with the woman who'd caused the bump thinking that was the end of the matter. Later that day, though, the driver whose car had been hit sent the woman a photo of the back of her car, along with a text that suggested that she thought it had been damaged. For some reason, the woman who'd caused the bump failed to respond. So around 6 weeks later, the other driver sent her several more messages.
In the messages, the claimant had suggested that she was trying to sell her vehicle and that the value of the vehicle had gone down as a result of the impact.
She now wanted the other driver to hand over £200. This was a definite change in tone. They'd already agreed the cars had been none the worse following the prang, which the policyholder pointed out.
She definitely had reservations about the impact causing any damage because she did go on to say, please be honest with me.
Despite her nagging doubts, the policyholder agreed to pay the £200, but then forgot to transfer the money.
So the claimant sent some further messages to chase her up to make the payment, and at the same time indicated that she'd submitted a claim to the insurance company.
Things were now getting serious. Despite the fact that she'd agreed at the scene there'd been no damage, the claimant was now making a formal claim to pay for fixing the car.
She appointed an accident management company in the first instance, but that claim was completely dropped, and it was dropped because there was no evidence of any damage sustained as a result of the impact.
That, though, wasn't enough to put the claimant off. In fact, she added to her claim.
For the first time, she indicated when she sent the further messages that she was making a claim for injury as well. And that came as news, I think, to the defendant driver, who really didn't think any damage had been caused. The injury that she was claiming for was a whiplash injury. It was neck and then lower back as well. But the impact was so minimal, it was hard to see how she could have sustained the injury that she was alleging.
She was claiming for a whiplash injury, even though the accident management company hadn't been able to find any proof the collision had caused any damage to the vehicle. This didn't make sense. But Sarah had a hunch about what was really going on.
We think that the catalyst for the claim was the fact that the defendant driver had forgotten to pay the £200. We actually think it was to do with the fact that she was trying to sell her vehicle and she was trying to find a way to recoup any losses that she might have.
The insurance company rejected the claim for injury. With 2 failed claims under her belt, this determined driver decided to up the ante.
She commenced court proceedings for compensation for her injury and some miscellaneous losses. She was claiming for up to £3,000 for her injury and her minor losses.
The woman had submitted an expert's report to back up her injury claim, and that wasn't straightforward either.
That medical report was from a medical examination at 10 months post-incident. And it also indicated that the claimant had fully recovered at the 4-month mark. So actually, at the time she put in for the injury, she'd actually just recovered from the injury. So it was all very odd.
If the woman was intent on pursuing this to the court doors, Sarah felt she should be properly challenged.
In light of the evidence, we mounted a really robust defence, and we pleaded that the claimant was fundamentally dishonest in bringing her claim. The key evidence in this case was the messaging between the parties, because it was quite clear from that messaging that there was no injury at the scene and there was no injury claim being progressed until later on. I think the other thing that really supported the defence of this claim was the fact that there was pre-existing damage and there was no evidence of any damage of impact.
Sarah didn't want to waste the court's time with what seemed like an open and shut case.
We put all the evidence to the claimant and her solicitors at that point, and we made an offer that the claimant could discontinue her claim and walk away from the claim effectively.
The driver finally saw sense and did just that.
There was a clear concern that if she went to trial, she may be found to be fundamentally dishonest.
For Sarah, this claim had been nothing but an opportunistic attempt to make money.
I think what stood out most to us about this particular claim is the fact that the claimant really did try or saw an opportunity to gain some cash and didn't then walk away from it at an early stage when she didn't get that £200. In fact, to then try for more is just quite appalling, really.
Nearly 70% of adults in the UK have contents cover, which can offer protection for valuables at home and when you're out and about. Those finding themselves needing to put in a claim may be asked to prove ownership of the item by sending in a receipt or a photo of it. These are often digital, so any chancers thinking they can get away with making a false claim should remember that any evidence will be thoroughly scrutinised using the most up-to-date techniques. The claimant in our next case had been abroad, soaking up the sun in Ibiza. But the holiday spirit was soon dashed when she lost some of her most valuable items on her journey home.
She got a train back from the airport and then she got a taxi home from there, and she'd lost a small wash-type bag which she carried her jewellery in. There were several items missing and some sunglasses.
The holidaymaker wasted no time in attempting to track down her valuables. She contacted the airline, train company and taxi firm to see if anything had been handed in. But when, 3 weeks later, she'd had no joy, the woman contacted Direct Line to put in a claim on her home insurance policy for all the contents of her lost wash bag.
The customer reported to us that the items of jewellery that were missing were 2 pairs of earrings, 2 gold necklaces, a gold ring and some designer sunglasses.
The holidaymaker's lost possessions were high-end and had cost a substantial amount of money.
2 pairs of earrings that were reported missing were £200 each. The ring was £2,500. The sunglasses were over £1,000 and the 2 necklaces were over £1,000. So in total, it was a claim worth over £6,000.
At first, the holidaymaker's claim appeared genuine. But following standard procedure, the woman was asked to provide evidence that she'd owned the missing jewellery and sunglasses.
The customer sent in a photograph for proof of ownership. So this was showing her wearing the items that were missing.
At first glance, the photo appeared to be above board. But when Sarah examined the metadata, the information which shows when and where a digital image was taken, she noticed that things didn't add up.
The photograph was taken actually a day after the loss was reported to have happened. So this raised our suspicions.
The woman would need to explain why the photo she'd supplied as evidence of ownership had been taken after she'd lost the items. But before that happened, Sarah had a few more routine checks to carry out.
When reviewing the customer's claim, it's standard to review a customer's claims history. So we reviewed this customer's claims history and discovered it was extensive.
Excluding the current case, this holidaymaker had submitted an astonishing 9 other claims between 2016 and 2019, a fact she'd kept firmly under wraps.
We noted that she hadn't declared this when she took out the policy, and if she had declared it at the time, especially the amount of claims that were there, we wouldn't have given cover. Somebody with this extensive claims history is a big red flag to us. It shows that they have extensive knowledge of the claims process and procedures.
With every new discovery, Sarah grew increasingly suspicious of the woman and her claim. Before her concerns were put to the holidaymaker, Sarah had one final line of inquiry to follow, a deep dive into the woman's social media activity. What this unearthed was damning.
There was several social media posts on her social media accounts where it showed that she was wearing the jewellery and that she reported missing, and these were after the date that she reported they went missing.
In an attempt to get to the bottom of this highly suspicious claim, Sarah needed the holidaymaker to explain herself. And the woman did have an explanation.
The customer explained that these were replacement items that she purchased afterwards and that she would provide us with a receipt.
The receipt for the new items looked convincing at first glance. When Sarah took a closer look, yet again, she noticed the details just didn't match up.
We noted the date on the receipt was the 16th of September. The posts that we'd viewed on her social media account were prior to this date and after the date of loss.
How could the holidaymaker be wearing items of replacement jewellery before she'd even bought them? Sarah needed to put an end to this highly suspicious claim. So she asked the woman to explain how the picture she herself had supplied as evidence could have been taken the day after she lost her bag.
The photograph that originally drew our attention to be suspicious because it was taken after the date of loss was explained away, and she actually provided information that it was a screenshot. That's why the date was the day after. But when she provided the original, it actually was the day of loss. So she was actually wearing them on the day of loss, which in itself is suspicious. Why would you take it off? And from reviewing her social media, we could see that she did wear them quite frequently. It wasn't saved for a special occasion, and she wore them daily.
Sarah had heard enough. She wasn't at all convinced by the woman's excuses.
From reviewing the original photograph that came into us as evidence of what was missing, the social media posts and the extensive claims history, it became apparent that this was a completely fraudulent claim.
As a consequence, the team at Direct Line declined the woman's claim, cancelled her policy and invoked the fraud clause on it. The woman's details were also uploaded to the insurance fraud register, which will make it difficult for her to get any type of insurance in the future and make it tricky to get other types of financial products too. Trying to cash in on this bogus claim had backfired on this holidaymaker big time.
By loading the customer up to the insurance fraud register, it shows that we as a company take this type of fraud very seriously, and we look to protect those innocent parties from inflated premiums.
Still to come, a chancer who claimed a collision with a bus left him with serious injuries is exposed as a liar when the true extent of the accident is revealed.
The car driver had said that he'd been jolted forwards and backwards. When we viewed this on the CCTV footage, this was not the case. So it's highly unlikely anyone would have been injured in such a minor accident.
Our next case is about three people who pretended not to know each other when they were involved in an accident. What they clearly didn't realise, though, was that their claims would be thoroughly scrutinised, with investigators searching their social media and even online electoral roll entries. All the information was already in the public domain, and it helped investigators join the dots and prove they were all connected. This case all started one April morning with a collision on a roundabout in Dagenham. The resulting claims had raised suspicions, so were picked up by Anthony Carrington and his intelligence team at Flint Bishop Solicitors.
Claimant's version of events was that they were travelling around a roundabout. The insured drove into the rear of them as the claimant's vehicle was slowing down.
There were two people in the car that had been hit, a male driver and a female passenger. The policyholder, the driver of the car which crashed into the back of the claimants, was the first to contact his insurer. He reported the accident and admitted it was his fault. The rest of his account, though, was surprisingly brief.
He phoned but gave no real detail as to the wider accident circumstances.
But it was a different story when the claimants got in touch with the insurer. They had plenty to say for themselves.
They provided a note from the scene with the at-fault driver's details, contact number and address.
They also said the other driver hadn't left a safe braking distance and that they'd both been injured in the accident.
The driver said that he sustained soft tissue injury to his neck, lower back, knee and calf. The passenger in the claimant vehicle said that she sustained soft tissue injuries to her neck, lower back and left shoulder. Both claimants alleged that they were also suffering from minor psychological injuries.
On top of the compensation the two were seeking for their injuries, they were also asking for a payout for physiotherapy, money to cover the damage to the car, as well as credit hire charges for a replacement vehicle. This all added up to a significant amount.
The total value of the claims presented was around £15,000.
As the policyholder had phoned up to admit liability, on the face of it, the case looked genuine. But cracks quickly started to appear when Anthony reviewed the medical report submitted to back up the personal injury claims.
The injuries described in the medical evidence were different from that which was described in the claims notification forms. We noted a number of inconsistencies as to where they sustained soft tissue injuries, and there was no mention of psychological damage in their initial notifications.
These differing accounts set alarm bells ringing, but they weren't the only thing that was strange when it came to the claimants' injuries. The insurer had offered them further rehabilitation to help them recover from their soft tissue injuries, but neither of the claimants had taken this up.
That struck us as quite weird, as if somebody had genuinely sustained a whiplash-type injury, you would question why they would not accept that offer of help.
The investigators' next move was to look into the history of the claimant's damaged car. Their concerns escalated further when they discovered that it had only been purchased a few weeks before the incident at the roundabout, and that the car had been previously written off following a different accident. For Anthony, the involvement of a newly bought car, which had already been deemed a total loss by insurers, was a massive red flag.
The reason that a recent purchase of a vehicle would be a concern, we see that quite frequently as an indicator for staged accidents. There's also a concern that the fact that the vehicle was a previous total loss and written off, there could have been a repeat of the claim for prior accident damage.
Next, the investigators turned their spotlight onto the male claimant's driving history. What their searches revealed only added to Anthony's apprehension about the case.
The driver in the claimant vehicle had been involved in a high number of accidents in a short period of time, all around the date of the accident that we were investigating. When we conducted investigations and inquiries with other insurers who looked at the claimant driver, there were also a number of responses that came back from those insurers to suggest that they had concerns with the claims that had been presented too.
The driver was either very unlucky or he'd submitted a string of dodgy claims. Either way, the investigators felt it was time to get back in touch with the policyholder who'd caused the collision to get a fuller picture of his version of events, as he'd said so little in his initial call. They did manage to catch him on the phone on several occasions, but each time he said he wasn't free to give a statement.
On the final telephone call from the claims investigator, the at-fault driver said that he'd already admitted liability and said that he would not be cooperating with the insurer's investigations any further.
This wasn't the reaction the investigator expected.
This was concerning to us because it would be quite unusual for a genuine at-fault driver who's admitted liability to completely refuse to cooperate with his own insurance company's investigations any further.
With the policyholder's strange behaviour now another cause for concern, the investigators decided to scrutinise his social media accounts and those of both the claimants. What they uncovered proved to be very enlightening.
We discovered that the first claimant was using an alias.
The investigators suspected, after digging further, that the male claimant had hidden behind this alias to try to hide the fact that he actually knew the policyholder.
That social media investigation disclosed the fact that the at-fault driver was friends with a number of individuals with the same family name as the claimants.
And they had more than a passing acquaintance. In fact, it looked as if the driver who'd admitted causing the crash was in a relationship with the other driver's sister. Yes, that's the other driver who was making a claim against him. All this made it highly likely that the three people knew each other before their prank.
Both claimants had presented this as a genuine accident where they didn't know the at-fault driver at all. So the fact that we had connections potentially between the occupants of the two vehicles is a red flag for the accident being potentially staged.
The social media evidence Anthony had gathered strongly suggested a link between the three, but he needed solid proof to back this up. The intelligence team dug deeper into their backgrounds.
We also looked further to corroborate this. Those investigations included looking at financial backgrounds and electoral roll checks.
Where they hit on the conclusive proof they'd been looking for.
Those electoral roll checks confirmed that the at-fault driver and the claimants had actually lived at two previous addresses together at the same time. This was clear evidence that both parties were known to each other.
Anthony was now certain that these claims were fabricated and that the crash had never happened. The claims were rejected, but by then court proceedings were already underway, initiated by the couple claiming for injuries. It was time for Anthony to share his evidence with their solicitor, and the claims were stopped dead in their tracks.
The claimants agreed to discontinue their claim, which had been proceeding in Romford County Court. They also agreed to pay our clients costs of £1,500.
Anthony's intelligence team had well and truly scuppered this trio's shameless plot.
What stood out to me about this claim was the fact that the claimants were using aliases on social media and that they were trying to perhaps bury the connections that they had to the policyholder, and the brazen way in which they presented their claim as a genuine one, when in fact it was clearly a staged accident.
There are very few places you can go these days without being caught on camera, with the average person being captured on UK CCTV up to 70 times a day. Whilst that's bad news for the camera shy, it's a valuable resource for insurance investigators, helping them to bust bogus claims. Around Britain, 4 billion journeys are taken by bus every year. That's quite some responsibility for the men and women whose job it is to ferry us from A to B. These drivers are highly trained. However, accidents do sometimes happen. So when 4 people claimed a collision with a bus left them with personal injuries, it fell to Samantha Meaden to get to the bottom of it.
Our driver was looking to turn right out of a terminus and onto the road. A car had turned left onto the road that our driver was turning onto and was stationary in traffic. He'd allowed room for our bus to pull out, but as our bus started to proceed, he then changed position to try and make more space. As the bus proceeded forward, it struck the rear of the car.
The car was full.
There were 4 people in the car. There was the car driver, who was a 49-year-old male. There was a 49-year-old female and 2 other passengers.
All of them said they'd been injured and were quick to get their claims in.
We received the claims within 10 days of the date of the accident for all 4 occupants of the car.
It sounded pretty nasty. The 3 passengers claimed they'd suffered with whiplash, while the driver listed a catalogue of injuries.
The car driver had said that he'd been jolted forwards and backwards. He also claimed for injury to his neck, his right shoulder and lower back.
It seems the man's life had been profoundly affected by the crash.
So there was a lot that the claimant said that he was prevented from doing as a result of his injuries. They included sleep, being able to lift heavy items, do the shopping and do any DIY.
To add to his woes, he'd had to hire a replacement car, while his own damaged car was off the road.
In addition to injuries, he put in a claim for 34 days credit hire and 28 days storage, and in addition, the recovery charge for removing his vehicle from the scene.
With legal costs added on top, this was turning into an expensive claim.
If all claims had proceeded, they would have been in the region of £28,000.
Serious stuff. It was therefore strange that the man at the wheel hadn't even seen his GP after the accident.
We were told that the car driver did not seek any medical attention, but he self-medicated and did exercises himself.
Bearing in mind his long list of injuries, Samantha found this suspicious. She needed another perspective on this prang.
Photographs were taken by our bus driver at the scene, and these showed that the bus had sustained some scratching, and then there was damage to the driver's side rear of the car.
The driver's evidence seemed to corroborate the claimant's story. But further investigation into his background raised eyebrows further.
We register the claim on the insurance database, which is used by insurers to establish whether any of the people presenting a claim have made claims before. In this instance, we found that the car driver had made 3 in the last 3 years.
This wasn't in itself proof of any wrongdoing, but it was enough to put Samantha on alert. She needed to know whether she was onto something or not, and she turned to the most reliable witness of all.
Our buses are fitted with multiple cameras, so we view that very carefully and we assess what has been told has happened versus what we can see on the CCTV footage.
The footage clearly showed the bus had come into contact with the car, which meant First Bus was liable for the damage.
The CCTV footage did show that a collision had occurred and showed that we had damaged the car driver's vehicle. So, of course, we were happy to pay for the repairs to his vehicle.
That, though, was the only part of the driver's story the CCTV backed up, as it also showed that the contact between both vehicles was minimal. The footage taken inside the bus shows that those passengers were barely disturbed. So how could the 4 occupants of the car have come off so badly?
It's highly unlikely that anyone would have been injured in such a minor accident. The car driver had said that he'd been jolted forwards and backwards, When we viewed this on the CCTV footage, this was not the case.
Samantha wouldn't be paying out on this claim.
The CCTV footage was disclosed immediately to the car driver's solicitors, highlighting our concerns with the evidence.
At this point, the passengers withdrew their claims and the driver went to ground. Until a year and a half later, when, out of the blue, he submitted a medical report.
The medical report confirmed that the car driver had suffered a whiplash-type injury to his neck, a soft tissue injury to his right shoulder, and pain to his lower back, as well as travel anxiety.
Samantha just wasn't buying it and was sticking firmly to her guns.
With our concerns with the CCTV footage, we did not believe that anyone could have been injured in such a minor collision. So no offers were put forward in settlement of the car driver's claim for personal injury.
Now it was the driver's turn to dig in his heels.
Car driver's solicitors then issued county court proceedings.
When the case was heard in court, the driver didn't get an easy ride.
The car driver was subjected to a gruelling 3.5 hours cross-examination by our defence barrister. During this time, his inconsistencies within his evidence started to stack up.
Under questioning and with the CCTV evidence to back up Samantha's case, the man's injury claims started to crumble.
He changed his story 3 times as to how he moved on impact as he tried to justify his injuries.
His claim for storage costs also took a battering.
During the cross-examination, he advised that he didn't have anywhere to park his damaged vehicle, so he had to put his vehicle into storage. He later admitted that he did have an alternative space where he could have parked his damaged vehicle.
This was an open and shut case.
The judge saw through the claimant's lies and found that this was a fundamentally dishonest claim. The claimant was ordered to pay £3,500 towards the defence costs.
The outcome of this dodgy claim was a win for First Bus, but Samantha would have preferred not to have received the claim at all.
Where our drivers are at fault, we're happy to pay out on the damage we've caused to vehicles, but it's absolutely appalling that they think they can put in exaggerated and inflated claims. It's dishonest.
Another shocking case of deception and a timely reminder that we all need to remain vigilant to the scourge of insurance fraud. From chancers exaggerating injury to criminal gangs engineering crashes for cash, these tricksters hit us all in the pocket. Every year, insurers lose millions to these scams, and it's you, the policyholder, who ends up paying the price in hikes to your premiums. But the sheer number of thieves caught in the act sends a clear message to anyone thinking about cheating the system. They claimed, but now they're shamed.